The bell above the door of Bloom and Thorn chimed at 7:14 in the morning, which was unusual because Celine Morrow did not open the shop until 8. She was in the back workroom with her hands buried in a bucket of ice water, conditioning the stems of 200 white roses that had arrived before dawn for a wedding order due by noon. Her copper-red hair was tied back with a green ribbon. Her linen apron already damp with water and flecked with bits of leaf and thorn. The ginger cat, Thistle, was asleep on a stack of tissue paper beside the wrapping station, his tail twitching in some private dream about birds or mice, or whatever it was that cats dreamed about. The bell chimed again, which meant someone had not just opened the door, but was now standing in her shop, in the dim pre-opening quiet, among the buckets of flowers and the hanging dried lavender and the smell of earth and green things growing. Celine dried her hands on her apron and walked through the curtain that separated the workroom from the shop floor. She walked with the particular posture of someone who had spent years learning to enter rooms at an angle, to present her right side first, to give people a moment to see the beautiful half before the ruined half registered. It was not vanity. It was survival. She had learned through 1,000 small cruelties. The gasps, the stares, the children who pointed, the men who looked away, that the world was kinder to her when she controlled the reveal. But the person standing in her shop was not looking at her face at all. A small girl, no more than 5 or 6, was standing with her nose pressed against the glass door of the display cooler, her breath fogging the surface, her enormous brown eyes wide with the kind of wonder that only children and artists are capable of sustaining. She wore a bright yellow dress and pink sneakers, and her dark, curly hair was arranged in 2 puffballs held with colorful beads that clicked softly when she moved her head. She was alone. "Hello," Celine said, and the girl turned and looked at her with the fearless directness of a child who has not yet learned to be afraid of anything. "Are all these flowers yours?" the girl asked. "They are. Well, they belong to the shop. I take care of them." "All of them?" "Every single one." The girl's gap-toothed smile was incandescent. "That's the best job in the whole world," she said, with the absolute conviction of someone who has never had to pay rent. Celine found herself smiling, which was unusual. She did not smile easily. She had trained the muscles of her face, particularly the scarred left side, where the skin was tight and resistant, to maintain a careful neutrality that protected her from the world's reactions. But this child's delight was so pure, so uncomplicated by the pity or revulsion that adults brought into this space, that Celine's face responded before her defenses could engage. "Where are your parents?" Celine asked, because a 6-year-old alone in a shop at 7 in the morning was a situation that required adult intervention, regardless of how charming the child might be. "My nanny is outside. She's on the phone. She told me to wait on the bench, but I saw your flowers through the window and I had to come in." "I had to. They're so beautiful. Can I touch one?" Celine looked through the shop window and saw a young woman in a dark jacket standing on the sidewalk, phone pressed to her ear, her back turned to the shop. The nanny had not noticed the child's absence. "You can touch this one," Celine said, pulling a single pink peony from a bucket and holding it out. "Gently. Peonies are delicate." The girl took the flower with both hands, cradling it as if it were a living creature, which in a sense it was. She brought it to her face and inhaled deeply, and her eyes closed, and an expression of such complete happiness crossed her face that Celine felt something crack open in her chest, something she had kept sealed for years. The simple act of a child smelling a flower, the simple proof that beauty still existed and could still be received with joy. "I'm Sophia," the girl said, opening her eyes. "I'm Celine." "Selene, that's a moon name. My mama told me about the moon goddess before she went to heaven." The words landed with a weight that belied their casual delivery. "Before she went to heaven," said the way children say such things, with the matter-of-fact acceptance that comes before the full understanding of loss settles in. "Your mama sounds like she was very smart," Celine said carefully. "She was. She knew everything about stars and flowers, and she made me this. Sophia held up her small wrist, showing a beaded bracelet in bright colors. She made it when I was a baby, so I would always have something of hers. Selene understood this gesture in a way that went deeper than words. She carried her own version of it, the scars on her face and hand, which were, in their terrible way, a permanent reminder of the night she had tried to save her brother and failed. You carried the people you lost on your body one way or another. The nanny appeared in the doorway, breathless and panicked. Sophia, you can't just wander off like that. Your father will... I'm so sorry. Sophia, come here right now. Sophia looked at Selene with the conspiratorial expression of a child who knows she is in trouble but does not regret the adventure. Can I come back? She whispered. Any time, Selene said. The flowers will be here. Sophia was pulled out of the shop by her flustered nanny, and the bell chimed behind them, and the shop was quiet again. And Selene stood among her flowers and realized that her heart was beating differently than it had 5 minutes ago. Something had shifted. Something small and warm had entered her carefully constructed solitude and left a mark. She went back to her roses and told herself it meant nothing. Children wandered into shops. It happened. It did not need to mean anything. Sophia came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. It became a routine. Every morning at approximately 7:15, the bell above the door would chime, and Sophia would appear in her bright colors, and her beaded hair, and her boundless enthusiasm for everything that grew. The nanny, whose name was Clara, would stand outside on the sidewalk with an apologetic expression and her phone, giving Sophia 10 minutes in the flower shop before they continued their morning walk to the private school 3 blocks away. In those 10 minutes, Selene taught Sophia the names of flowers: peony, dahlia, ranunculus, delphinium, freesia. She taught her how to hold stems without crushing them, how to smell flowers by breathing gently rather than inhaling sharply, how to tell if a rose was fresh by the firmness of its petals. She taught her that flowers were not just beautiful objects, but living things with their own rhythms and needs, that they opened and closed with the light, that they turned toward the sun, that they could communicate with each other through chemical signals released into the air. Sophia absorbed this information with the seriousness of a scholar. She asked questions that were startlingly perceptive for a 6-year-old. Do flowers feel pain when you cut them? Why do some flowers smell and some don't? If flowers can talk to each other, can they talk to people too? Selene answered every question with the same respect she would have given an adult, because she believed that children deserved honest answers, and because Sophia's curiosity reminded her of her own at that age, before the fire, before her brother's death, before the world had taught her that beauty and destruction were not opposites, but neighbors. What struck Selene most was that Sophia never once mentioned her scars. Not once. She looked at Selene's face the way she looked at the flowers, as a whole thing, not divided into beautiful and ruined halves. When Sophia reached for Selene's hand to examine a stem more closely, she grabbed whichever hand was nearest, scarred or unscarred, with equal ease. When she looked up at Selene to ask a question, her enormous brown eyes moved across Selene's entire face without hesitation, without the micro-flinch that adults could never quite suppress. For Selene, who had spent 12 years navigating a world that could not look at her without reacting to her damage, this was revolutionary. This small girl's complete indifference to her scars was more healing than any therapy she had ever attempted, more powerful than any affirmation she had ever received. It was proof that the scars were not the totality of who she was, that a person existed behind them who was worth seeing, worth knowing, worth visiting every morning at 7:15. If this story is already pulling at your heartstrings, if you can feel something beautiful forming between Selene and little Sophia, hit that subscribe button right now. Trust me, this story goes places you won't expect, and you do not want to miss a single moment. Subscribe to Crimson Vow Tales and turn on that notification bell. 3 weeks into Sophia's daily visits, Selene learned who her father was. It happened by accident. A man came into the shop one afternoon, a broad man in a dark suit with an earpiece and the unmistakable bearing of private security. He looked around the shop with eyes that were cataloging exits and potential threats rather than admiring the arrangements. He picked up a business card from the counter, studied it, studied Selene, and left without buying anything. That evening, Selene mentioned it to Maria, the woman who ran the bakery 2 doors down, who knew everything about everyone in the neighborhood. "A man in a suit with an earpiece came into my shop today," Selene said. "Just looked around and left." Maria's face changed. "Did a little girl come into your shop recently? Dark skin, curly hair, beads in her hair, talks a mile a minute?" "Sophia, she comes every morning." Maria leaned across her bakery counter and lowered her voice. "That is Sofia Costa. Her father is Rafael Costa." The name landed in Selene's stomach like a stone. Everyone in this city knew who Rafael Costa was. He controlled the eastern districts. He was involved in things that newspapers hinted at but never quite named. He was the kind of man whose name made shopkeepers nervous and police officers look the other way. "The man in the suit was checking on you," Maria said, "making sure his daughter is safe. He probably has a file on you by now. Your name, your history, your credit score. These men, they don't leave anything to chance when it comes to their families." Selene went back to her shop and sat behind the counter in the fading afternoon light and considered what she had learned. The child she had been teaching about flowers was a Mafia boss's daughter. The 10 minutes of uncomplicated joy she received every morning came attached to one of the most dangerous men in the city. She should have been afraid. She should have told Clara that Sophia could not come to the shop anymore, that the association was too dangerous, that she wanted nothing to do with that world. She had spent her entire adult life building a small, safe space, surrounded by beauty, and inviting the attention of a man like Rafael Costa was the opposite of safe. But she thought of Sophia's face when she smelled the peony. She thought of the gap-toothed smile and the beaded bracelet and the questions about whether flowers could feel pain. She thought of a little girl who had lost her mother and found something worth visiting every morning in a flower shop run by a scarred woman who had lost her brother. She could not close that door. She would not. The incident that changed everything happened on a Saturday afternoon in the city park. It was the kind of afternoon that the city produced perhaps a dozen times a year, when the weather was warm enough to draw people outdoors, but not so warm that they retreated to air-conditioned interiors, when the light was golden and generous, and made even the most mundane scenes look like photographs worth keeping. The park was full of the weekend rhythms of families and couples and solitary joggers, of dogs chasing balls and children chasing each other, and elderly men sitting on benches with newspapers they had finished reading an hour ago, but continued to hold as a prop for their observations of the passing world. Vendors sold ice cream from carts that played tinny melodies. A group of teenagers were sprawled on the grass near the fountain, their laughter carrying across the water. Selene was there by coincidence, which is what people call the events that later seem like destiny. She had gone to the park to photograph wildflowers for a new arrangement she was designing, a commission from a restaurant that wanted something that looked foraged rather than cultivated. She had been in the park for an hour, moving from bed to bed, crouching in the grass with her camera, finding angles that captured the particular wildness she was looking for. She loved this work, the outdoor part of her job that most florists neglected, the act of going to where the flowers actually grew and studying them in their natural context, rather than in the artificial environment of a wholesale market. She was crouched beside a patch of clover near the duck pond, her camera in one hand and a small pair of scissors in the other, completely absorbed in the way the light was catching the tiny white flowers, when she heard the scream. It was not an adult scream. It was a child's scream, high and thin and terrified, and it cut through the peaceful Saturday sounds of the park like a blade through silk. Selene was on her feet before the scream finished, moving toward the sound with the instinctive urgency of someone who had once run into a burning building to save a child she loved. She found them near the flower beds on the eastern side of the park. Sophia was on the ground, her small body rigid, her face swelling rapidly, her breath coming in horrible, rattling gasps that sounded like someone trying to breathe through a straw that was being slowly pinched closed. Clara the nanny was kneeling beside her, frantic, screaming into her phone, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it. What happened? Selene dropped to her knees beside Sophia. A bee sting. She's allergic. The EpiPen, I had it in my bag, but it's not there. I can't find it. It must have fallen out. I don't... Selene looked at Sophia's face. The swelling was advancing rapidly. Her lips were turning blue. Her eyes, those enormous brown eyes that had looked at Selene every morning with uncomplicated joy, were wide with terror and beginning to glass over as her airway constricted. This child was dying. Selene's mind shifted into a mode that was not quite thought and not quite instinct, but something between them, something forged in the years she had spent learning from her grandmother about the medicinal properties of plants. Her grandmother had been a herbalist before the word became fashionable, a woman who grew healing things in her garden and knew which plants could save a life and which could end one. Selena had inherited that knowledge along with the flower shop, had studied it formally in addition to the folk wisdom, had shelves in her workroom filled with tinctures and dried herbs and preparations that most florists would not recognize. She knew what anaphylaxis was. She knew that without epinephrine, Sophia's throat would close completely within minutes. She knew that an ambulance in this city took an average of 12 minutes to arrive, and that Sophia did not have 12 minutes. She had perhaps 4, but she also knew something else. She knew that certain compounds found in specific plants could slow an allergic reaction. Not stop it, not reverse it, but slow it enough to buy time. Her grandmother had taught her this. Her formal study had confirmed it. She had never had to use the knowledge in a crisis, but she carried it the way she carried everything her grandmother had given her, like a sacred trust. She looked around the park with eyes that most people did not possess, eyes trained to see plants not as decoration, but as a living pharmacy. The flower beds near the duck pond, the herb garden that the city maintained near the park entrance, the wild plants growing in the unmowed margins along the fence line. Keep her upright, Selene told Clara. Don't let her lie flat. Keep talking to her. I'll be right back. She ran. She ran faster than she had run since the night of the fire, faster than the night she had sprinted through a burning hallway toward her brother's bedroom and arrived 30 seconds too late. She ran to the herb garden near the park entrance and dropped to her knees and began pulling plants with the precise, rapid movements of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. Wild chamomile. She found it growing in a cluster near the garden's edge and pulled a handful, crushing the flowers between her scarred fingers to release the essential oils. Plantain leaf, the common weed that grew everywhere and that most people walked past without a second glance. She grabbed fistfuls of it, and then she saw it, growing in a neglected corner of the herb bed, a patch of stinging nettle that the gardeners had not yet cleared. Nettle contained natural antihistamine compounds. Her grandmother had used nettle tea for allergic reactions her entire life. Selene gathered what she needed in less than 90 seconds and ran back to Sophia. The child was worse. Her face was grotesquely swollen, her breathing reduced to a thin whistling sound that was barely audible. Clara was sobbing, holding Sophia upright as instructed, her phone on the ground where the emergency dispatcher was still talking. Tinny and distant and completely useless against the reality of a child suffocating in a park on a Saturday afternoon. Selene knelt and crushed the plantain leaves between her palms, working them into a rough poultice with the speed and precision of someone performing a procedure she had practiced 1,000 times. She pressed the crushed leaves directly against the bee sting on Sophia's arm, holding them firmly. With her other hand, she took the chamomile flowers and the nettle and crush them together, releasing their oils and compounds into a fragrant green mass. "Sophia, I need you to chew this," Celine said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her body. "It tastes bad, but you need to chew it and swallow it. Can you do that for me?" Sophia's eyes found Celine's face, and even through the swelling and the fear and the diminishing oxygen, something in those eyes recognized the woman from the flower shop, the woman who knew the names of every flower, the woman who had never once looked at Sophia with anything but kindness. Sophia opened her mouth, and Celine placed the crushed herbs on her tongue. The child chewed. She gagged. She swallowed. And Celine held her and waited. The herbs were not a cure. Celine knew this. They were a bridge, a way to slow the cascade of histamine that was closing Sophia's throat, to buy the minutes that the ambulance needed to arrive with the epinephrine that would actually save her life. It was the difference between a river in full flood and a river held back by a temporary dam. The dam would not hold forever, but it might hold long enough. Within 2 minutes, Sophia's breathing changed. It was still labored, still frightening, but the thin whistling sound had opened slightly, as if a pinch straw had been released just enough to allow a fraction more air through. The swelling had not reversed, but it had stopped advancing. The blue tinge on Sophia's lips faded from deep blue to a lighter shade that suggested oxygen was reaching her blood again. Not enough, not nearly enough, but some. "You're doing so well," Celine whispered, holding the child against her chest, the scarred side of her face pressed against Sophia's swollen cheek. "You're so brave. The help is coming. Just keep breathing for me. Just keep breathing." The ambulance arrived 7 minutes later. The paramedics administered epinephrine, and the reaction began to reverse immediately, the swelling receding, the breathing opening, the color returning to Sophia's face. They loaded her onto a stretcher and into the ambulance, and Clara climbed in beside her, still crying, still shaking, still clutching her phone. Celine stood in the park with crushed herbs staining her hands and watched the ambulance disappear, its sirens cutting through the peaceful Saturday air, and she realized she was shaking so violently that her knees could barely support her. She sat down on the grass beside the flower beds and put her face in her green-stained hands and wept. She wept for Sophia, who had nearly died in her arms. She wept for her brother, who had died in a fire 12 years ago, while she screamed his name from the other side of a wall of flame. She wept for herself, for the girl she had been before the fire, for the woman she had become after it, for the scars that covered half her body and the scars that covered all of her heart. She wept because she had saved a life. And saving a life when you have failed to save one before is not just relief. It is resurrection. She sat in the grass for a long time after the weeping stopped, her hands still stained green, the smell of crushed herbs on her fingers mixing with the park's afternoon fragrance of grass and warm earth and distant water. She thought about her grandmother, who had died peacefully in her sleep 3 years after giving Celine the shop, who had spent her final years teaching Celine everything she knew about the healing properties of plants. She thought about the old woman's hands, gnarled and soil-stained, moving through the herb garden behind the shop, with the confidence of someone who understood that the boundary between medicine and magic was thinner than most people believed. Her grandmother had told her once on a winter evening when they sat together by the fire, and Celine was still learning the names and properties of herbs, that knowledge was a responsibility, that knowing which plants could heal was not a skill, but a calling. That one day, her grandmother said with the quiet certainty of someone who had lived long enough to trust her own intuition, Celine would be in a situation where her knowledge was the only thing standing between someone and death, and in that moment she would understand why she had spent all those hours memorizing Latin names and chemical compounds and the precise dosages that separated remedy from poison. Selina had believed her grandmother in the abstract way that young people believe the wisdom of their elders, which is to say she had filed it away as theoretical rather than practical. But sitting in the park with the ambulance sirens fading into the distance, and the green stains drying on her hands, she understood that her grandmother had been right. The knowledge had been the bridge. The years of study, the jars of tinctures, the shelves of dried herbs in her workroom, the inherited wisdom of a woman who had grown healing things in her garden, had all converged in a single desperate moment in a city park on a Saturday afternoon, and a child was alive because of it. She whispered a thank you to her grandmother, to the air, to whatever was listening, and then she stood up, collected her camera and her scissors from where she had dropped them in the grass, and walked home through the golden afternoon light, carrying in her body the trembling aftermath of what she had done and the slow dawning understanding that something in her life had permanently changed. Rafael Costa learned what had happened within the hour. His security team monitored Sofia at all times. The man in the suit who had visited Selena's shop was one of 4 rotating guards assigned to his daughter's protection. The guard who had been covering the park from a distance had seen the incident unfold, but had been too far away to intervene in time. He had watched through binoculars as a red-haired woman with scars on her face had sprinted across the park, gathered plants from a herb garden, and saved his boss's daughter's life with a handful of weeds. Rafael received the news while sitting in his office in his compound, reviewing financial documents related to a shipping operation that moved goods through the port under the supervision of his organization. His second-in-command, a quiet man named Torres, delivered the information with the careful neutrality of someone who knew that any news involving Sofia could trigger an earthquake. Sofia had an allergic reaction in the park. Bee sting. The nanny lost the EpiPen. Rafael's hands went still on the documents. His face became a mask. "She's fine," Torres said quickly. "She's at the hospital. The reaction has been fully reversed. She's stable, talking, asking for ice cream." "The nanny lost the EpiPen," Rafael repeated, his voice quiet in a way that was more dangerous than shouting. "There's more. The woman who saved her, a florist from the neighborhood. She used some kind of herbal treatment to slow the reaction until the paramedics arrived. The doctors said that, without her intervention, Sofia would not have survived the wait for the ambulance." Rafael stood up from his desk. The chair rolled back and hit the wall behind him. His face had not changed from its mask, but something behind his eyes had shifted, a tectonic movement that Torres recognized as the precursor to either devastating violence or devastating gratitude. With Rafael, they came from the same place. "Who is she?" Rafael asked. "Selene Moro. She owns a flower shop called Bloom and Thorn. She's the one Sofia has been visiting every morning." Rafael walked out of his office without another word. He drove to the hospital himself alone, which was something he almost never did. He found Sofia in a pediatric room decorated with cartoon animals, sitting up in bed, eating strawberry ice cream, chattering to Clara about the flowers in the park as if she had not been minutes from death 2 hours earlier. Clara was sitting beside the bed, looking like a woman who had aged 10 years in a single afternoon. Rafael knelt beside his daughter's bed and put his face against her small hand and stayed there for a long time, feeling her heartbeat through her fingers, feeling the reality of her aliveness, feeling the enormous, terrifying fragility of everything he loved, concentrated in this tiny person in a hospital bed, eating ice cream. "Papa," Sofia said, patting his head with her sticky hand. "Don't be sad. The flower lady saved me. She used magic plants." "Magic plants," Rafael repeated into her hand. "She knows everything about flowers, Papa. She knows which ones are medicine, and which ones are just pretty, and which ones are both. She's the smartest person I ever met." Rafael lifted his head and looked at his daughter's face, still slightly swollen, still bearing the evidence of how close she had come to leaving him the way her mother had, suddenly, without warning, taking everything that mattered with her. And he made a decision that he did not fully understand, but could not resist. He needed to find the woman who had saved his daughter's life. He needed to look at her and thank her, and understand why a stranger would sprint across a park and use knowledge that most people did not possess to save a child she had no obligation to save. Every single moment of this story carries weight. Celine's herbs, Sofia's smile, Raphael's grief. It all connects, and it all matters. If you're feeling this the way I'm feeling it, hit that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to Crimson Vow Tales. This love story is unlike anything you've heard before, and we're just getting to the part that will shatter you. He went to the flower shop the next morning. It was 8:15. The shop was open, the green door propped wide to let in the morning air, the window boxes overflowing with color. He stood outside for a moment, this man who commanded the eastern districts, who had ordered operations that moved millions and silenced enemies, who had built a criminal empire through intelligence and will and the careful application of force, and he felt uncertain. He felt for the first time in years like he did not know what to do with his hands. He walked in, the bell chimed, and Selene appeared from the back workroom, wiping her hands on her apron, her copper-red hair escaping from its ribbon, her amber eyes catching the morning light. She turned toward him, and he saw her face in full for the first time. The right side was beautiful, the kind of face that stopped you on the street, that made you look twice, that lingered in your memory. High cheekbones, full lips, those extraordinary amber gold eyes. And the left side was a landscape of scar tissue, pinkish white and textured, pulling the skin tight along her jaw and cheekbone, extending down her neck and across the hand that held her apron. She watched him look. She always watched people look. It was the part she hated most, the moment when a new person's eyes moved from the beautiful side to the scarred side, and something changed in their expression. Pity, revulsion, curiosity, sometimes all three, flickering across a face in rapid succession before the person composed themselves and pretended they had not noticed. Raphael did not do any of those things. He looked at her scars the way he looked at everything, directly, completely, without flinching, He looked at them the way a man looks at a map of a country he wants to understand. And then he looked at her eyes, and his expression held something she had never seen in a stranger's face before. It was not pity. It was recognition. The recognition of someone who carries their own damage, who understands what it costs to survive something that should have destroyed you. "You saved my daughter's life," he said. "You're Sophia's father, Rafael Costa, and I owe you a debt that I don't know how to repay." "You don't owe me anything. Sophia she comes here every morning. She's special. Anyone would have done what I did." "No," Raphael said, and his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "They would not. Most people would have called for help and waited. You ran across a park and pulled plants from the ground and put them in my daughter's mouth and held her while she choked, and you saved her life with knowledge that most people do not have and courage that most people do not possess. That is not what anyone would have done. That is what you did." Selene stood behind her counter, surrounded by the flowers she had devoted her life to, and looked at this man who was everything she should be afraid of and felt, against every instinct her scars had taught her, utterly safe. "Would you like a cup of tea?" she asked, because she did not know what else to say. Rafael Costa, who drank espresso in crystal cups in his modernist compound, who had not drunk tea since his mother made it for him when he was a child, said, "Yes, I would like that very much." She made chamomile tea because it was what she had, and because chamomile was the plant of calm, of peace, of the body's return to equilibrium after crisis. They sat at her small workbench in the back of the shop, surrounded by buckets of flowers and dried herbs and the tools of her trade, and they talked. They talked for 2 hours. They talked as customers came and went, served by Selene between sentences, returning to the workbench and to Raphael as if pulled by gravity. They talked as the morning light shifted through the shop, illuminating different flowers at different angles, turning the space into something that changed with every passing minute. Selene watched him hold his teacup and noticed that his hands, despite their scars and their calluses and the compass rose tattoo on his right hand, held the small cup with extraordinary care. He held it the way Sophia held flowers, as if the object might break, as if the act of holding something fragile required a particular kind of attention that he was not accustomed to giving, but was willing to learn. She noticed the gold wedding band on his right hand and understood its significance without asking, because people who carry their dead with them recognize the gestures of carrying in others. He asked her about the shop. He asked questions that most customers never bothered with, questions that went beneath the surface of what she did and into the architecture of why she did it. How did she choose which flowers to stock? How did she decide on arrangements? What was the difference between a flower that would last 3 days and one that would last 10? How did she know when a plant was sick? How did she heal it? She answered his questions the way she answered Sophia's, thoroughly, honestly, without simplification. She explained that flowers communicated their needs through subtle signs that most people ignored. A rose that was dropping petals too early was thirsty. A lily whose leaves were yellowing was drowning. A peony that refused to open was stressed, needed warmth, needed time, needed patience. The skill was not in the arrangement, but in the listening, in the willingness to pay attention to living things and respond to what they were telling you. "You're describing my daughter," Raphael said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite humor and not quite sorrow, but something between the two. "She communicates in ways I sometimes struggle to read. She misses her mother in ways she doesn't have words for yet, and it comes out as questions, as excitement about flowers, as the need to touch every beautiful thing she sees. She isn't just visiting your shop because she likes flowers. She's visiting because you give her something she needs, something I can't give her." "What's that?" "A woman who is comfortable with brokenness. A woman who doesn't pretend that everything is fine when it isn't. Sophia has been surrounded by people who perform wellness around her. The nanny who smiles too brightly, the teachers who use careful language, the fathers of her friends who look at me with pity they're trying to hide. You don't do any of that. You're just honest. You stand in your shop with your scars and your flowers, and you're honest about what the world is. And my daughter, who has been fed a steady diet of people pretending the world is something it's not, recognizes honesty when she sees it." Celine felt the weight of his words settle into her chest. She had spent 12 years believing that her scars made her less approachable, less attractive, less able to connect with other people. And this man was sitting in her workroom telling her that the very thing she had hidden from was the thing that made her valuable to his daughter. The first cup of tea became a second. The second became a conversation that extended past the 2-hour mark and into the territory of things that neither of them had intended to share. She learned that Raphael had grown up in poverty in the southern part of the city, that his mother had cleaned houses for wealthy families, that he had started working at 14 to help her pay rent. She learned that his entry into the criminal world had not been a dramatic choice, but a gradual slide, a series of small compromises that accumulated, until one day he looked around and realized he was standing at the top of an organization he had never consciously decided to build. She told him about her grandmother, about the old woman who had lived in a house that smelled of rosemary and sage, who had grown herbs in her garden that the neighbors came to her for when they were sick, who had taught Celine that the line between poison and medicine was not the plant but the dosage. She told him how her grandmother had given her the flower shop when she was too old to run it herself, how she had transferred not just the business, but the knowledge, decades of accumulated wisdom about which plants healed and which ones harmed, which combinations could ease pain and which could stop a heart. "She would have liked you," Celine said, surprising herself. She had a weakness for dangerous men who were trying to be good. She said they were like foxglove, beautiful and deadly, but absolutely essential if you knew how to use them. Raphael laughed, and the sound transformed his face so completely that Selena felt her breath catch. When he laughed, the danger fell away, and the man underneath was visible, the man who bought his daughter ice cream and wore his dead wife's ring, and sat in a flower shop, drinking chamomile tea, because a scarred woman had offered him a cup. He came back the next day, and the day after that. He began arriving with Sophia in the mornings, making the flower shop part of their routine instead of just Sophia's secret adventure. He would stand near the door with his hands in his pockets while Sophia and Selene worked together at the counter, their conversation a constant stream of botanical facts and 6-year-old observations that somehow always circle back to the essential questions of existence. Can flowers feel love? Do they know when someone is taking care of them? Does the sun love the flowers more than the rain does? Selene watched Raphael watching his daughter and recognized the particular quality of his attention. It was the attention of a parent who understands that childhood is finite, that these moments of gap-toothed wonder will pass and never return, that the small girl with beaded hair who asks whether flowers dream will one day be a woman who no longer asks such questions. He watched Sophia the way Selene watched cut flowers, with the full knowledge that beauty was temporary and that this knowledge made it more precious, not less. He started staying after Sophia left for school. He would linger in the shop, helping Selene unpack deliveries, learning to condition stems, learning the names of flowers he had never noticed, despite living in the same city as them for 39 years. He learned that ranunculus came from Persia and that their name meant little frog because they grew near water. He learned that chrysanthemums symbolized loyalty in some cultures and death in others. He learned that the language of flowers was an entire vocabulary, that you could say things with a bouquet that you could not say with words. One morning, he arrived with a single white peony, the same flower that Sophia had first held in the shop. He placed it on the counter in front of Selene and said nothing. Selene looked at the flower. "Where did you get this?" "I bought it from the market at 5 this morning." The vendor looked at me like I had lost my mind. I suppose a man in a $3,000 suit buying a single peony at 5 in the morning does look unusual. "Why a peony?" "Because it was the first flower you gave my daughter. Because it was the moment she fell in love with this place and with you. Because I wanted to give you something that meant something, and I don't know your language yet, but I'm learning." Selene held the peony and felt its weight in her hand, felt the cool firmness of the petals, felt the particular miracle of a flower that exists for such a brief time and is so absurdly, defiantly beautiful during that time that it makes you angry at the impermanence of things. She looked at Raphael, who stood in her shop with his rolled sleeves and his tattoo and his dead wife's ring and his dangerous reputation, and she felt the careful walls she had built around her heart begin to crack. "Thank you," she said, and it was the most inadequate word in any language for what she was actually feeling. Their conversations deepened. They talked during the quiet hours of the late morning when the shop was empty, sitting at the workbench with tea between them, surrounded by the fragrance of flowers and the distant sounds of the neighborhood outside. They talked about loss, about the particular shape of grief, when it has been carried for years and has become part of your body's architecture, as permanent as bone, as essential as breath. He told her about Valentina's death. He had never told anyone the full story, not the clinical details, which were a matter of medical record, but the emotional reality of finding the woman he loved collapsed on the kitchen floor while their 2-year-old daughter sat in her high chair calling for Mama. He told her about the guilt, the irrational belief that his criminal life had somehow brought this punishment upon him, the way he had sealed off his heart after Valentina's death and devoted everything to Sophia, using his daughter as both the reason to keep living and the shield against ever loving someone again. Selene told him about the fire. She had never told anyone the full story either. The details she gave were not the ones in the newspaper reports or the medical records, but the ones she carried in her body. The smell of smoke, the sound of her brother calling her name from behind a door she could not open, the pain of the fire eating her skin as she tried to reach him, the moment when the firefighters pulled her out and she knew, with a certainty that destroyed something fundamental in her, that her brother was not coming out. They sat in the back of a flower shop and showed each other their wounds, and something happened between them that neither of them had the vocabulary to name. It was not attraction exactly, though that was part of it. It was not gratitude, though that was part of it too. It was the particular intimacy that forms between two people who have been broken in ways that the world cannot see, and who recognize in each other the shape of their own damage. Raphael began coming to the flower shop, not every day but often. He came in the mornings when Sophia visited, and he watched his daughter interact with Selene, watched the way Sophia's presence transformed the scarred woman into someone luminous and open, and he felt something stirring in the part of his heart that he had locked away when Valentina died. He brought Sophia on Saturday mornings, making it a ritual. He would sit on the stool near the counter while Sophia helped Selene arrange flowers, her small, dark hands working beside Selene's scarred ones and the image of the two of them together, creating beauty from raw materials, struck him as the most honest metaphor for life he had ever witnessed. He noticed things about Selene that surprised him: the precision of her movements, the economy of her gestures, the way she handled thorns without flinching because she understood that beauty and pain were part of the same stem. He noticed that she spoke to Sophia as an equal, never condescending, never simplifying, trusting the child's intelligence in a way that most adults did not. He noticed that she smelled of lavender and earth, and that her hands, even the scarred one, moved with a grace that made him want to watch them indefinitely. He noticed that she never touched him, that when their hands came close to meeting over the counter or the workbench, she withdrew slightly, a movement so subtle that most people would not have caught it, but that Raphael, who had spent his career reading the body language of dangerous men, registered immediately. She flinched from contact, not from fear of him specifically, but from the general fear of touch that comes from spending years in a body that people react to with visible discomfort. On a Thursday evening, 6 weeks after the park incident, Raphael came to the shop at closing time. Selene was in the back, dismantling the day's unsold arrangements, separating flowers that could be repurposed from those that had passed their peak. Her hair was down, which was unusual, falling in copper curls around her face and obscuring the scarred side. "Sophia talks about you constantly," Raphael said from the doorway of the workroom. "She told me yesterday that she wants to be a florist when she grows up. Last month she wanted to be a dolphin trainer. The month before that, an astronaut. But I think this one might stick. You've given her something she's never had before." "What's that?" "A woman she admires. She lost her mother so young that she doesn't have memories of her, only stories. But you're real to her. You're present. You show her every day that a person can be hurt and still be beautiful, still be strong, still be the kind of person who runs toward danger instead of away from it." Celine's hand stopped moving among the flowers. She did not look at him. She looked at the stems in her hands, at the green stains on her fingers, at the familiar evidence of a life spent in the service of growing things. "You don't know me," she said quietly. "You know the version of me that exists in this shop, surrounded by pretty things. You don't know the version that wakes up at 3 a.m, hearing her brother's voice through a door she can never open. You don't know the version that hasn't been touched by another person in 12 years, because she can't stand the way people's hands hesitate when they feel the scars." Raphael stepped into the workroom. He moved slowly, the way he had learned to move around his daughter when she was frightened. Not with the predator's stillness he used in his professional life, but with the careful gentleness of a father approaching a child who has had a nightmare. "I know exactly who you are," he said. "I know you are a woman who lost her brother in a fire and carries the evidence of her love for him on her body. I know you are a woman who built a life out of beauty when the world tried to define you by destruction. I know you saved my daughter's life with your bare hands, and a knowledge that comes from generations of women who understood that the earth provides what we need if we know how to ask." He was standing in front of her now, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something subtle and warm, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body. close enough that he could see the tears gathering in her amber eyes and the way her scarred hand trembled as she held a stem of white roses. "May I?" he asked, and he reached toward her face, slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She did not pull away. His hand touched the scarred side of her face. His fingers traced the ridged skin along her jaw, the tight surface along her cheekbone, the place where the scar tissue met the smooth skin of her forehead. He touched her the way she touched flowers, with reverence, with attention, with the understanding that what he was holding was alive and precious and deserved to be handled with care. No one had touched her scars like this, not the doctors who had treated them, whose touch was clinical, not the therapists who had helped her process them, whose touch was professional. No one had touched them the way Raphael was touching them now, as if they were not something to be endured or overcome, but something to be acknowledged and honored, as if they were not evidence of destruction, but evidence of survival. Celine closed her eyes. A tear escaped and ran down her scarred cheek, following the ridges and valleys of the damaged skin. Raphael caught it with his thumb. "You are the most beautiful woman I have ever seen," he said. "And I include my late wife in that statement, and I loved her more than I loved my own life. You are beautiful, not despite what happened to you, but because of how you chose to survive it. Because you took destruction and turned it into a flower shop. Because you took loss and turned it into knowledge that saved my daughter. Because you are standing here right now, letting me touch you, even though every cell in your body is screaming at you to run." Celine opened her eyes and looked at him, and for the first time in 12 years, she let someone see her completely. Not the right side and the left side, not the beautiful half and the ruined half, all of her. The whole broken, healing, terrified, courageous entirety of who she was. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "So am I," Raphael said. "I haven't loved anyone since Valentina. I sealed that part of myself shut because I thought it was the only way to survive. But you walked into my daughter's life and then into mine, and now I'm standing in a flower shop at closing time with my heart in my throat, asking a woman with the most extraordinary eyes I have ever seen if she would consider letting me love her." He kissed her. He kissed the scarred side of her face first, pressing his lips against the textured skin of her cheek, against the ridged landscape of her jaw, against the place where the scar met her neck. He kissed the places no one had ever kissed, the places she had hidden and protected and believed were unlovable. And then he kissed her mouth, and the kiss tasted of chamomile tea and tears, and the beginning of something that neither of them had expected and both of them needed. In the days that followed, Celine experienced something she had forgotten was possible, the feeling of being wanted. Not in the abstract way that customers wanted her flowers, or that the neighborhood wanted her shop to stay open. Wanted specifically, individually, by a person who had seen every broken piece of her and had not looked away. Raphael came to the shop every morning now. Sometimes he arrived before she opened, standing outside the green door with 2 cups of coffee from the cafe down the street, waiting for her to come downstairs in her apron, with sleep still in her eyes, and Thistle the cat winding between her ankles. He learned her morning routine the way a student learns a language, by immersion, the way she checked the temperature of the cooler first, then the water levels in every bucket, then the condition of each arrangement, her scarred hand moving from flower to flower with the practiced efficiency of a doctor doing rounds. He brought Sophia every morning, and the 3 of them developed a routine that felt to Selena like something she had read about in books, but never believed existed in real life. Sophia would arrive bursting with questions accumulated since the previous morning. What happens to flowers when they die? Do they go to flower heaven? Can you plant a dead flower and make it alive again? And Selene would answer with the honest gentleness that she had developed for this particular child, this child who had lost her mother and was learning to navigate the world's cruelties one flower at a time. Raphael watched these exchanges with an expression that Selene was beginning to recognize. It was the expression of a man who had believed his heart was permanently sealed and was discovering, with equal parts terror and wonder, that it was not. He looked at Selene and his daughter together and saw something he had not dared to imagine since Valentina's death, a future that contained more than survival. He took Selene to dinner on a Friday evening, to a restaurant in the old part of the city where the tables were small and the candles were real, and the waiter called everyone signore and signora with the particular Italian formality that makes every meal feel like an occasion. She wore a dark green dress that she had bought specifically for this evening, the first dress she had purchased for a social occasion in years, and she had left her hair down, which meant that the scars on her neck were visible, which meant that she was choosing for the first time in her adult life to enter a public space without hiding. Raphael noticed. He noticed because he noticed everything about her, because paying attention to Selene Morrow had become the most important occupation of his life, surpassing the management of a criminal empire that had previously consumed every waking hour. He noticed the dress and the hair and the way she held her chin slightly higher than usual, and he understood what it had cost her to make those choices, and he loved her more for the courage of them. Over dinner, he told her something he had never told anyone except Valentina. He told her about his mother, who had died of exhaustion when he was 20, worked to death by a system that treated poor women like disposable machinery. He told her that his entry into the criminal world had been, in the most fundamental sense, a response to his mother's death, a decision that no one he loved would ever again be destroyed by poverty, by the casual cruelty of a world that did not care about people who could not afford to defend themselves. It started as protection, he said. It became something else. It became power, and power is addictive, and addiction makes you do things that the person you used to be would not recognize. I have done things that I cannot undo. I have hurt people who did not deserve to be hurt. I have made choices that my mother, if she could see me, would weep over. But you're here, Selene said. You're sitting in a restaurant telling me the truth about who you are. That matters. That's not the behavior of a man who has given up on being good. I gave up on being good a long time ago, Raphael said. And then my daughter was born, and I had to reconsider. And then you saved her life, and I had to reconsider again. You keep making me reconsider, Selene. Every time I look at you, every time I see what you've built from what the fire left you, I have to reconsider whether the choices I've made are the only choices available. Selene reached across the table and took his hand. She took it with her scarred hand, the left one, the one she had spent 12 years keeping out of sight, pulling back from contact, hiding beneath counters and inside pockets. She placed her damaged fingers over his damaged knuckles and held on. My grandmother used to say that the best gardens grow in burned soil, she said. The fire destroys everything, but it also returns nutrients to the earth. The things that grow afterward are stronger, more resilient, more alive than what came before. She said the same thing about people. Raphael looked at their joined hands on the white tablecloth, her scarred skin against his scarred skin, and he raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, every one of them, the smooth ones and the ridged ones, with the same attention and the same tenderness. Ivan Kessler made his move 6 days later. Raphael's intelligence network detected the threat before it materialized. Kessler had been acquiring properties near Raphael's distribution centers, placing his people in positions that gave him access to shipping schedules and delivery routes. It was a slow encirclement, a financial siege, and Raphael recognized the strategy because it was the same one he would have used if he were trying to dismantle someone else's operation. But Kessler made a mistake that men like him always make. He assumed that Raphael's emotional connections were weaknesses rather than sources of strength. He sent a message, delivered through a series of intermediaries, that was designed to be unmistakable. He knew about Sophia. He knew about the flower shop. He knew about the scarred woman. The message was not a threat. It was worse than a threat. It was a promise that if Raphael did not cede his territory and accept Kessler's terms, the people he loved would be used to persuade him. The specific language was corporate, sanitized, the language of a man who treated human suffering as a line item in a spreadsheet. Raphael's response was not immediate. The old Raphael, the Raphael who existed before Sophia and before Selene, would have responded with overwhelming force, with the kind of violence that sent messages throughout the criminal underworld. But the man who sat in his office reading Kessler's terms was not that man anymore. He was a father who had almost lost his daughter in a park. He was a man who had kissed a woman's scars and meant it. He was someone who was beginning to understand that power was not the same as strength, that destruction was not the same as victory. He gathered intelligence. He built a case. He used the connections he had spent 2 decades cultivating, not the criminal ones, but the legitimate ones, the relationships with prosecutors and investigators who owed him favors for information he had provided over the years. He compiled evidence of Kessler's money laundering, his connections to international fraud networks, his systematic intimidation of legitimate businesses. He built a dossier that was not a weapon of violence, but a weapon of truth. And then he arranged a meeting with Kessler in a neutral location, a restaurant in the financial district. He went alone. He sat across from the gaunt man in the wire-framed glasses and placed the dossier on the table between them. "This goes to federal prosecutors tomorrow morning," Raphael said, "unless you withdraw from my territory, completely and permanently. Every property, every person, every connection, gone by the end of the month." Kessler looked at the dossier. His pale blue eyes behind his glasses moved across the first few pages, and Raphael watched the color drain from his face as he understood the scope of what had been compiled. This was not a bluff. This was comprehensive. This was devastating. "You could have simply killed me," Kessler said, and there was genuine bewilderment in his voice. "I considered it," Raphael said, "but I'm trying to be a different kind of man, for my daughter, for someone else who matters. So instead of killing you, I'm offering you the opportunity to walk away. Take it, or don't take it, and spend the rest of your life in a cell." Kessler took the deal. He had no choice. The evidence was too complete, the threat too credible, the alternative too permanent. Within 3 weeks, his people had withdrawn from Raphael's territory. Within a month, Kessler had relocated to another country entirely, taking his gaunt frame and his wire-framed glasses and his detached cruelty to a place where Raphael's dossier could not follow him. Raphael drove from the restaurant to the flower shop. It was evening and the shop was closed, but the light in the upstairs apartment was on, and he could see through the window the shape of Selene moving through her small space, tending to the plants that covered every surface, living her quiet life among growing things. He stood on the sidewalk below and looked up at the lit window and felt something release in his chest, a tension he had been carrying since the moment Kessler's message arrived, a knot of fear and fury that had been wound so tightly it had affected his ability to breathe. She was safe. Sophia was safe. The threat had been neutralized not through violence but through intelligence, through the strategic deployment of truth, through the kind of power that did not require anyone to bleed. He rang the bell beside the green door, and when she came down to let him in, he held her in the narrow stairwell for a long time without speaking. He pressed his face into her copper-red hair and breathed in the scent of lavender and earth and the particular warmth of her skin, and she held him back, her scarred hand on the back of his neck, her fingers in his close-cropped hair, and they stood in the stairwell between the flower shop and her apartment and let the silence say everything that words could not. "Is it over?" she asked. "It's over." "Are you all right?" "I am now." She led him upstairs, and they sat together in her apartment, among the plants and the braille books and the ginger cat who regarded Raphael with the studied indifference of a creature who has decided that this particular human is acceptable but should not assume permanent welcome. They drank chamomile tea because it was always chamomile tea in this place, and they talked about what had happened and what came next. Spring arrived, and with it, change. Raphael began the process of legitimizing his operations, a slow and painful transformation that he had contemplated for years, but never had sufficient motivation to pursue. The motivation now had two names: Sophia, who deserved a father she could be proud of, and Selena, who had shown him that it was possible to take destruction and transform it into something that gave life. He came to the flower shop every morning now. He sat on the stool near the counter and watched Sophia help Celine arrange flowers, and he felt the last frozen parts of his heart thaw and crack and begin to heal. He drank chamomile tea and ate pastries from Maria's bakery and talked about things he had never talked about: his childhood, his mother, the first time he held Sophia as a newborn and understood that his life had a purpose beyond power. Selene let him in, slowly, carefully, with the same attention she gave to nurturing a fragile seedling. She let him touch her face, both sides, without flinching. She let him hold her scarred hand in public, in restaurants and parks, and on the sidewalks of a city that had only ever seen her hide. She let him see her at 3 a.m. when the nightmares came, and she woke gasping with the smell of smoke in her nostrils and her brother's name on her lips. She let him hold her through those moments, his arms around her, his voice in her ear saying, "You are here, you are safe, you are not in the fire anymore." She began spending time at Raphael's compound, and the contrast between the cold, modernist architecture and Sophia's chaotic warmth became a metaphor that she appreciated more each time she visited. The refrigerator covered in crayon drawings, the pink bicycle in the hallway, the toys scattered across leather furniture that had been chosen for its sleek design and was now serving as a climbing frame for a 6-year-old who had no regard for interior aesthetics. Raphael's compound was not a home. It was a fortress that a little girl was slowly, stubbornly converting into a home through the sheer force of her presence. Celine began to help with the conversion. She brought flowers, not the elaborate arrangements she created for clients, but simple things: a jar of wildflowers on the kitchen counter, a potted herb garden on the windowsill, a climbing jasmine in a terracotta pot that she placed by the entrance so that the first thing anyone smelled when they walked through the door was not concrete and glass, but living green fragrance. She was doing to Raphael's compound what she had done to her own life, introducing beauty into a space that had been designed for function and control, reminding the architecture that its purpose was not to intimidate, but to shelter. Raphael watched these small transformations with the quiet attention of a man who was beginning to understand that home was not a structure, but a feeling, that safety was not achieved through walls and cameras, but through the presence of people who loved you, who chose to be there, who brought wildflowers and chamomile tea and the steady reassurance that you were worthy of tenderness. On a morning in May, when the window boxes of Bloom and Thorn were overflowing with peonies and the entire street smelled of flowers, Sophia came into the shop with her backpack and her gap-toothed smile and a drawing she had made at school. The drawing showed 3 figures standing in front of a building covered in flowers. The tallest figure had dark skin and a suit. The middle figure had red hair and a dress. The smallest figure had puffballs in her hair and a yellow dress. Above the figures, in careful 6-year-old handwriting, were the words, "My family." Selena looked at the drawing and pressed her scarred hand to her mouth and tried not to cry, and failed. Raphael looked at the drawing and knelt down and pulled his daughter into his arms and held her against his chest and closed his eyes and thanked whatever force in the universe had led a small girl into a flower shop and changed the trajectory of 3 broken lives. "Papa," Sophia said, squirming in his embrace, "you're squishing me." "I know," he said. "I'm going to squish you every single day for the rest of your life." "Promise?" "Promise." Selene watched them and felt something bloom in her chest that she'd not felt since before the fire, something that she had believed the flames had burned away permanently, along with her skin and her brother and her belief that the world could be kind. It was hope. Not the fragile, tentative hope that she had learned to cultivate in the quiet solitude of her flower shop, but a robust, wild hope, the kind that grows not in cultivated gardens, but in cracks in the pavement, in the margins of burned fields, in the impossible spaces where nothing should survive, and yet life insists on persisting. She knelt down beside them, and Sophia wrapped one arm around her father's neck and one arm around Selina's, pulling them together, and for a moment the three of them existed in a circle of warmth and belonging that was stronger than fire, stronger than grief, stronger than the carefully maintained isolation that both adults had worn like armor for so many years. "My family," Sophia said again, and this time neither of the adults tried to correct her, because she was right. Years later, when Bloom and Thorn had expanded into a larger space on the same street, when Raphael's legitimate business holdings had replaced his criminal operations entirely, when Sophia was old enough to work the counter on weekends and had developed an encyclopedic knowledge of botanical Latin that impressed university professors, Celine would sometimes stand in the doorway of her shop at closing time and look out at the street where her life had changed. She would see the bench where Sophia had been told to wait that first morning. She would see the window where a small face had pressed against the glass, drawn by color and fragrance and the instinct that children have for finding the places where they belong. She would see the sidewalk where Raphael had stood, looking up at her apartment window after neutralizing the threat to their safety, his hands in his pockets, his heart in his throat, this man of violence and power reduced to something simple and vulnerable and human, by the fact that he had fallen in love with a woman who grew flowers. She would touch the scars on her face, which had not changed, which would never change, which would always be the map of the worst night of her life. But the meaning of the scars had changed. They were no longer evidence of what she had lost. They were evidence of what she had survived. They were the price of her courage, the receipt for a night when she had run into fire because someone she loved was in danger. And they were the reason, in a roundabout way, that she had ended up here, in a flower shop, with a man who loved her completely, with a child who had looked past the damage and seen the person underneath. Her grandmother had been right about burned soil. The best things grew there, the strongest things, the most beautiful, and the people who tended those gardens, the ones who knelt in the ashes and planted seeds despite everything they had lost, despite every reason the world gave them to stop growing. Those were the bravest people of all. Selene knew this now. She had lived it. She had become it. And every morning, when the bell above the door of Bloom and Thorn chimed and Sophia walked in with her gap-toothed smile and her father's hand in hers, she was reminded that the fire had not ended her story. It had only cleared the ground for something extraordinary to take root. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for walking through this story with Selene, Raphael, and little Sophia. Thank you for believing that scars are not endings but evidence of survival. Thank you for understanding that love can grow in the most damaged soil if you give it enough light and patience. If this story moved you, please subscribe to Crimson Vow Tales and hit that notification bell. Share this with someone who needs to hear that it is never too late to bloom. I read every single comment, and your stories inspire mine. Until next time, remember, beauty and destruction are not opposites. They grow from the same stem. Be the person who chooses to see the flower.